I'm Jono Buchanan. In the previous chapter, we looked at giving note names to the notes of a scale. We learned the difference between the major and the minor scale. We even began to discover that there are major and relative minor chords. And we began to discover that there are names that we give to the different steps of the scale. What a lot we've covered already. Now, it's the numbers that we assign to the steps of a scale that we're going to be focusing on in order to understand chords. I'll show you what I mean. So if this is our tonic note, C, this is 2, this is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so we can refer to those chords or these steps and we can apply chords to them. So I'll show you what I mean. If I say, okay, here is C, if I look at adding the third and the fifth, then effectively what I'm doing is I'm playing what we refer to as the chord of C major. Now, why is this the chord of C major and not C minor? Well, let's remind ourselves about the scale of C major. It's got this note in it. The scale of C minor has a flat version of the third of the scale, and as a result, a C minor chord would sound like that, whereas a C major chord sounds like that. So we've got 1, 3, and 5. And any chord, any basic chord can be broken up into 1, 3, and 5. So C major, 1, 3, 5. C minor, 1, flat 3, and 5. A major, 1, 3, and 5. A minor. G major. F major. E minor. Okay, so effectively what we've got here is our minor third before adding our fifth. So any note that we choose to start on, we can either add the major third or the minor third, and then the fifth is always going to be the same. Again, let me show you what I mean by that. If we take D, here's the root note, and here is the fifth. Now that's true in D major and in D minor. It's the third step that determines whether we're playing D major or D minor. So that's my sort of outline for D. And if I want to play D major, it's this note. And if I want to play D minor, it's this note. Now, in Logic, we've got a lot of help here because up here at the top of the transport bar, what we have is a chord detector. So if you're not looking at this display, when you first open up Logic, you usually get the kind of beats and project settings for the way that the transport bar looks. But if you come down to custom, what happens is the transport bar will open right up and show you a whole bunch of things, including this input setting here. And what's interesting is if I hold down a chord of D major, it says D. And if I hold down a D minor chord, it says DM, D minor, if you like. Now that's true if I come to G, or G minor, or C, or C minor. So it won't say C major, but what it will do is to show you what chord you're playing. So as you're learning these chords, that's a really useful little display to have up at the top, just to reinforce that you are playing the chord that you think you're playing, A minor, sure enough. Okay, so I can try it and I can see that being added. So effectively what we learn is a major chord has got its number 1, its number 3, and its number 5, and so does a minor chord, except that of course the third is going to be 1 semitone flatter. It's a totally different mood. So effectively we start playing, if I just wanted to sort of play a piece of music which is only in C major, compared to C minor, so the only note that's different is the major and the minor, and yet the whole mood is darker and sadder and a little bit more introspective. It's extraordinary how effectively that one note change unlocks a totally different sort of feel to the way that the music sounds. Okay, so a moment ago I said that the note numbers were important. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that's true when we start putting chords together. So if I play a C major chord, and then I decide that what I want to do is to play a chord 5 after this chord 1, okay, well chord 5 would be G. Okay, so if I then decide that what I want to do is to play a G major chord, the chord 5, I need to just work that out. So G major there's my third, and there's my fifth. So that's the chord of G major. So if I went from C major to G major, I'm playing chord 5, back to 1, back to 5, back to 1. So I've now got 2 chords, okay? Now these 2 chords relate to each other because C is my root chord and G is my chord 5 within C major. Remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So anything relating to G is going to be a 5 chord. And that's true for any other note in the scale. So if, for example, what I wanted to do was to play, let's say, the 2 chord, that would be here, and that would start on a D. Now, what I need to remember is that the scale of C major does this. So when it comes to playing D and chord 2, I'm going to be playing a minor chord because starting on the supertonic or the D or the second step of my C major scale, that's my basis for this chord. The notes that relate to it are always going to be the 3 and the 5 to make it a chord. But if I play an F sharp, I'm playing outside of C major. If I want to stay within the confines of C major, the chord 2 would be minor. So here's 1, here's 5, here's 2, and here's 1 again, okay? So what I can do is I can use the position of any note number and work out whether or not it would be a major or a minor chord. So 1, C, is going to be major. As we've just established, 2 is going to be minor. 3 is also going to be minor. 4 is major. 5, which we've already established, is major. 6 will be minor, and 7 is what we refer to as a diminished chord. Okay, now this one is our little rogue chord. We're going to come back to that in a moment. Now then, remember, if I want to play in C major, all of the notes I'm playing are just the white notes, and as a result, they allow us to determine whether or not we're playing major or minor chords. In a major chord, what we effectively have is the third 1, 2, 3, 4 semitones above the root note. And in a minor chord, it's only 3. So 4 semitones, and in a minor chord, just 3. So we can see that that's 3 again for the E minor chord, the chord 3. Major, major, minor, and then what we refer to is this diminished chord. Now then, let's just shine a little bit of a light on this chord for a moment. I have to only play the white notes because I'm in the scale of C major, which means that I can't play either this note or this note, which means that this chord here has got a minor third and another minor third. And that's what refers to it as a diminished chord. The interesting thing about diminished chords, actually, a little side note for a moment, is that they are entirely separated by minor thirds. And the crazy thing about any octave is that it can be broken down into minor thirds. So in other words, look. Now I'm back to B again. So you can see that the lowest note and the highest note are separated by an octave, and all of these notes are a minor third. This is the little arpeggio that used to be used in sort of silent movies where there'd be like a woman tied to a train track and there'd be a train coming. Peril, great peril is coming. Okay, so what we've got is this succession of minor thirds, and it's a really interesting chord. Okay, so what we've got is this diminished chord at the end. Sometimes it'd be a guy tied to the train track. That happened too. Still, the diminished chord was useful. Okay, so major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, and then we're back to our major chord again. Okay, so effectively, we can talk about those as major and minor chords, but what we can also do is refer to them as different chord numbers. 1, 2, 5, 4, 6, 5, 4, 5, 2, 3, 6, 7, there's our diminished, 1. So when we start putting chord progressions together, what we'll start discovering is it might say 1, 5, 4, 1. Okay, 1, and probably the most common chord sequence ever been written in pop songs over and over again is 1, 6, 5, 4, 1. Okay, so if I break those chords down, rather than just playing them all together at once, what we can do is to separate those notes out. You begin to hear how that might sound on a guitar or a keyboard when we start breaking chords down and we start playing them more musically than just thumping on them to spell out those different chords. So what we can start doing is saying, okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's write a chord progression together and then let's see what would it sound like. So if I said, okay, 1, 4, 2, 5, 1, 4, 2, 5, 1. Okay, well that sounds nice. We've just heard 1, 6, 5, 4, 1. So what would happen if we played 1, 4, 6, 5? Well, we hear that a lot in pop records too. Now at the moment, you can see that every time I play a chord, I'm playing it in exactly the same position. So in other words, I'm playing a root note and I'm playing 1, 3, 5 on top. There's C major with a root note and 1, 3 and 5. And when I move to chord 4, I'm thinking root note, 1, 3, 5 again. So the pattern that I'm jumping is exactly the same. I'm moving both of my hands across together. But generally speaking, when we start playing chords, we don't have to do exactly that. I'll show you what I mean. Here is a C major chord. And this is what we refer to as root position because the root is at the bottom. Fine. This is also a C major chord. It contains all of the same notes, C, E, and G. It's just that I've decided to put the E at the bottom and to move the C up the octave. So if I get rid of that note and I put it up there instead, I've still got a C major chord. It's just that I'm starting on the E. This is also a C major chord. It's just got the G at the bottom. Okay, again, all the same notes. They're all C major chords. So if I wanted to move from chord 1 to, let's say, chord 4, well, a moment ago I was playing that like this. There's chord 1 and there's chord 4. Right, well, let's think about that for a moment. There's chord 1 and chord 4, which is F, contains F, A, and C. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the C where it is, and I'm going to move up to an F and put my A there, which means that's an F major chord. I can see it up at the screen at the top. It's showing me that that's F. So rather than having to move my whole hand position from here down to here, what I can do instead is to go there. Similarly, if I wanted to move from 1 to 5, instead of moving my whole position down to a whole G major chord down here, I could say, actually, you know what? I'm going to put my G major chord here. Again, I've got the 3 notes of G major. G, B, and D. It's just that I've put the G at the top. So if what I do is I play the chords with the left hand playing the root note each time, but I keep my right hand playing chords that are a bit more sort of distributed around the same collection of notes here, we get a much more musical approach to the same idea. So here's the original way that I was playing 1, 6, 5, 4, 1. And here is another way I could play it. Okay, so I've got exactly the same chords and the left hand is moving the same way, but my right hand, rather than jumping in the same sort of shape, this kind of claw shape that I'm playing this chord with, instead what it's doing is it's saying, okay, you know what? I'm going to try and keep my hand in roughly the same place. So my chord 1 is here, there's my chord 6. They're the 3 notes of my A minor chord. Here is my chord 5, which I could either do this or I could do that. Same thing. Here is chord 4, and now I'm back to chord 1. So what you can start doing is thinking to yourself, right, what are all the ways in which I could play C major chord 1? Well, I could play it here, or here, or here. All those options are available to me, and they're all C major. Now then, this is where chords start to become quite interesting, because what we can also do is to pick out different bass notes supporting those chords. And the moment we do that, we start referring to inversions. Okay, so here is a root position chord. It's root position because the lowest note is the key note. I'm in C major and the root is C. Okay, that's a really familiar sound. Now then, I know that the next chord, or the next note within a C major chord, is an E. Okay, so what happens if I decide to put the E in the lowest note? It's still a C major chord, but this time it is the first inversion. This is the root position, and this is what's called the first inversion. I've inverted the notes of the chord, and I've put an E at the bottom. Now, the interesting thing about the sound of this chord is it doesn't feel like it's home in quite the same way that this one does. So here, everything's safe and secure and wonderful. We've arrived where we wanted to. And this chord here feels like it's going somewhere else. And to me, it feels like it's going there. Okay, so what we've then got, what is that I'm playing right now? Okay, well, that's chord 1 in root position. That's also chord 1 in first inversion. And then we're going to chord 4 in root position, because the chord 4 has got a root at the bottom. So inversions allow us to explore this idea of what we refer to as leading notes, notes that lead us somewhere new. So here is our root position C, here's our first inversion, and it feels like it's going there to me. Okay, so effectively what we've got is a first inversion. Now, what's the next note in the C major scale, C major chord? It's a G. Okay, so if that's root position and that's a first inversion, then it makes sense that the G underneath the C major chord would be the second inversion. And that's got a very different flavour again. If this feels home, and this feels like it's leading somewhere, this feels a little bit more open and a little bit less resolved, and to me it feels like it wants to go somewhere else, and that is... So what is that chord progression that I've just played? Okay, well that's C major, second inversion, and then chord 5, i.e. G major in a C major scale, because G is the 5th note of the scale, and then 1 root position. Sounds like the end of a hymn, in fact. Okay, so we've got 3 ways of playing C major. Root position, first inversion, second inversion, and then back to root position again. And we can do that in any chord. So if what I wanted to do would be to say, okay, what I'm going to do now is to play chord 1 first inversion, chord 4 first inversion, 1, well, that would sound like this. Okay, so what I did was to play my root position chord, then my first inversion, then my root position chord for chord 4, then my first inversion for chord 4, and then I went back to 1. Okay, so what we can begin to do is we can take our chords and we can decide what note is going to sit at the bottom of them. You talk to any bass player, and if you sort of say to them, yeah, I only want you to play the root position note, they won't be very happy. What they want to do is to express themselves by experimenting with what happens when they begin to play different notes underneath the chords that they play. And what happens when we're first exploring chords is, again, we fall into these familiar hand shapes. So in other words, I can play the same kind of combination of chords. The moment I slow down, I say, actually, okay, is this the best use of my C major? Or do I want it here instead? Let's give you another example. This is also C major. There's my 5th, and I've put the 3rd up the octave, and now it sounds childlike and fragile. And if I wanted to play chord 4, I could keep the C at the bottom. Okay, so now what I'm playing here is chord 4 second inversion, because the C is at the bottom and it's the second inversion above the 4th chord, which is F, and then I can go back to C. Okay, so I could then play, let's say, chord 6, which would be A minor, and I could play that as a first inversion. Back to C major again, okay? So how I spread my chords out, where I play them on the keyboard, has a huge effect on how they sound and how they make us feel emotionally. But all we have to do is to just take our time. And the great thing about working with all of this in Logic is that if you want to play in real time and you can't keep up with what your head wants to do, we'll take the metronome down to 40 beats per minute and take your time over the chords that you want to play, or play in whatever you want to, open up the piano roll display, and then move notes around. I'll show you what I mean. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to play a little chord progression, and I'm going to keep my little shape here. And what we're then going to do is to have a look at how we might move notes around to make a slightly more musical version of our chord progression. Let's play these 4 chords again. 1, 6, 5, 4, back to 1. Okay, so I'm going to keep the keyboard here, but what I'm going to do is have a look at the piano roll display, and I'm going to look at the notes that I've played. Let's just make sure that everything fits in here nice and easily. Okay, so I'm going to keep everything as a root position chord. I'm also going to just quantize it so all of the notes sit on their downbeats of each bar. We're going to keep these all as root position chords for now. So we're going to keep the left hand playing the root notes. So the first chord is C major. It's got a C in it, an E in it, and a G in it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this first C, and I'm going to take that up the octave. Okay, there's my first chord. Okay, so my A minor chord, which is chord 6, the 6th note of the scale, needs to contain an A, a C, and an E in it, which it does. Everything is fine. But what I want to do here is I'm going to just move this note around. And what I might do is to keep the C in the same position as it was for the first chord. Now, if you don't know this key command, it's really useful. Shift, Option, and down will make notes jump in octaves. So you can take notes wherever you like. And I'm going to try and see if I can keep the overall shape of my chords sort of centered around this particular area. Okay, now my next chord is a G, which doesn't have a C in it at all. It's got a G, a B, and a D. So what I'm going to do is take the G up an octave. Okay, well that's into the same sort of range, this sort of shape that we're looking at here. And then I'm going to select the lowest note, which is the B, and I'm going to take it up an octave as well. And then what we're going to do is the same thing again with our F chord, jumping these notes up, and in fact we could go back to having a C at the top. So effectively we've got our C coming back again here. This chord has moved up to the notes that it needs to play, and then we're back to our C, and what I did with the first chord was just invert it. Now we can see that effectively what we get as a result of moving these notes around is that rather than this kind of jumping pattern that we've got when we just play chords in the same chord shape the whole time, what we've got is a more even distribution of the notes. Effectively, no note within the chord is moving more than a tone. If I take the top note, it starts here, it plays the same note again in the next chord, then it drops a semitone, then it goes back up and it stays up. The next chord down rises a tone, drops a tone, rises a tone, drops a tone. The bottom one goes, plays the same note again, drops a tone, comes back up, and then it resolves again. And as a result, we get a much smoother, rounder sound. Which somehow just sounds more pleasing than. So So effectively, by inverting chords, whether we do that in the bass or whether we do it with the chords that we're playing up here in the right hand, effectively what we can do is to keep the same chord name, we're just inverting the shape of how those chords feel. And it saves us having to jump with the same sorts of chord shapes everywhere we go whenever we want to change the chord that we're working on.